Hello, my name is Pranav Parekh. I'm an Oracle Enterprise Architect within Oracle's Application Server, SOA, and BPM Technologies Group. This short video demonstrates the ease of setting up a WebLogic server cluster in a development environment. As depicted in the diagram, a domain is the basic administration unit for WebLogic server instances. A domain consists of one or more WebLogic server instances and their associated resources that you manage with a single administration server. A domain can include multiple WebLogic server clusters and non-clustered WebLogic server instances. A WebLogic server cluster consists of multiple WebLogic managed server instances running simultaneously and working together to prove increased scalability and reliability. A cluster appears to clients to be a single WebLogic server instance. The server instances that constitute a cluster can run on the same machine or be located on different machines. You can increase a cluster's capacity by adding additional server instances to the cluster on an existing machine, or you can add machines to the cluster to host the incremental server instances. Also depicted is the Node Manager, a utility that runs as a separate process from WebLogic Server and allows you to perform common operation tasks for a managed server, regardless of its location with respect to the administration server. If you run Node Manager on a machine that hosts managed servers, you can run and start and stop the managed servers remotely using the administration console or from the command line utility. Node Manager can also automatically restart a managed server after an unexpected failure. In this demonstration, we will use the WebLogic Server Configuration Wizard in graphical mode to create a clustered domain. A domain may also be created using the Configuration Wizard in a command line mode or by using the WebLogic scripting tool. As depicted in this diagram, for this particular domain, we will set up two managed servers as part of a cluster that are going to be managed using the admin server, and a Node Manager will also be running on the server to make sure that we can stop and start each of the managed servers. Launch the Configuration Wizard from the common bin directory of your WebLogic server home. Select to create a new WebLogic domain and click Next. The basic WebLogic server domain has already been selected. Also select to add the Oracle Enterprise Manager framework and click Next. Specify a domain name and then click Next. Specify the administrative username and password for this domain and click Next. Leave the domain in the development mode and click Next to go on to the next step. Now let's modify the managed servers, clusters, and machines for this domain. Now let's add two managed servers for our cluster, one running on port 7003 as managed server 1 and another one running on port 7004 running as managed server 2. Now let's create a cluster. The two previously configured managed servers will be targeted to this particular cluster. Let's assign the two previously configured managed servers to the cluster that we just created. Now let's configure the physical machine on which the managed servers and the cluster will be running on. Now let's assign the two managed servers that we configured to run on the machine that we just created. Verify the domain configuration information on the configuration summary screen and click Create to create the domain. Wait for the domain to be created. Once the domain has been created, start the admin server and click on Done. While the admin server is starting, go to the WebLogic server home directory to its server bin directory and start Node Manager. Once the admin server is in running mode and the Node Manager has been started, open up a browser to go to the administration console. Since we did not modify the administration server configuration, its default configuration port is 7001. Go ahead and log on to the administration console by going to http localhost 7001/console. Once the console deploys, log in to the administration console using the administrator username and password. Once logged in into the administration console, we can verify the 2 managed servers that we created in the cluster. As you can see, we have one administration server that is in running mode, whereas the 2 managed servers that are part of our cluster have not been started yet. Now, click on the Control tab and select the 2 managed servers, Managed Server 1 and Managed Server 2. Then click on Start to start the managed servers. Once you click on Start, a request gets sent to the Node Manager to start the selected servers. Also, as indicated, the state changes to starting for those managed servers. Click on the Configuration tab in a few minutes after issuing the Start command and notice that both managed servers are now in a running state. At this point, we are done with the 2-node cluster configuration as depicted in this diagram. The remaining steps are related to deploying a sample application to the cluster and configuring a load balancer to test our cluster. This is required since we will need to spread incoming requests across the managed servers that make up the cluster. HTTP servers, hardware load balancers, or a WebLogic managed server can be used to do the load balancing. To keep things simple, in this demonstration we will configure an instance of WebLogic managed server with a HTTP cluster servlet as the load balancer. We will create a new standalone managed server running on port 7002 as the load balancer instance. Now that we have the new managed server configured, we will target it to our machine that we had created earlier during the domain creation process. This will allow us to start and stop this particular server using Node Manager. Once we target the machine, we are now going to go ahead and start this particular managed server. Now we will deploy the HTTP cluster servlet to this particular managed server. Go to Deployments, click on Install, and browse to the appropriate directory where the HTTP cluster servlet has been configured. Pick the appropriate application, click on Next, and here we want to deploy this particular application as an application. So continue on to target where the application should be deployed. Here, pick the appropriate managed server and then click on Next to go to the next screen. Verify all the appropriate configuration settings here. In this case, we'll leave it as defaults and click on Finish. The HTTP cluster servlet that we just deployed comes as part of WebLogic server. The only thing that we had to do in this particular scenario was to specify the appropriate web.xml file as part of the deployment descriptors. As you can see here, we have defined a parameter called WebLogic cluster where we have localhost 7003 and localhost 7004, the 2 managed servers that we are going to load balance our request to. Now let's deploy the sample counter application to the cluster. However, before we deploy, let's take a quick look at the application itself. As you can see, this is a very simple one JSP application. In this JSP, we get the attribute called count from the session and then we increment it every time this page is loaded. We also then display the count variable towards the bottom of the page, and in addition to the count, we also display the implementation class for the session as well as the managed server's IP address and the managed server's port number. Now let's take a look at the WebLogic.xml deployment descriptor associated with this particular application. As you can see, we have specified within the deployment descriptor for the persistent store type for the session to be replicated. This indicates to WebLogic server that the session data should be replicated across the managed servers that make up that cluster. Let's switch back to the administration console and deploy this application to the cluster. Go to the deployments area, click on Install, and find the application that you want to deploy. I have the WAR file available here. I'm going to click Next. Once you do that, again, make sure that it's being deployed as an application. And we are going to be targeting this application to the entire cluster. Here we have the 2 managed servers, and both these managed servers will have this application deployed to. In addition to that, on the next screen, make sure that you select Copy this application onto every target for me so that this application gets deployed and copied over to each and every managed server in the cluster. Click on Finish to deploy the application. Once the counter sample application has been deployed, open up a new browser tab so that we can test the application. Go ahead and request a page going through the load balancing URL pointing at port 7002. As you can see, once this particular page is loaded, this is the first time we are visiting this page and the counter indicates 1. We also see that the session implementation is being done by the replicated session data class. In addition to that, this particular request was handled by the managed server that's obviously running on this particular server but running on port 7004. Now let's go ahead and reload the page a few times to make sure that the counter gets incremented every time we reload the page. One of the other things that you'll also notice as we're incrementing the page is that it's being served by the same managed server within the cluster. And this is because of the sticky sessions. And now let's go back to the administration server and stop the managed server that's running on port 7004. And we'll come back to this particular page and reload this page to indicate that the session has not been lost and that the session counter will get updated to 10. However, the managed server that's going to be handling the request will be the only running server in the cluster, which is on port 7003. So let's go to the administration server, go to our servers, go to our controls tab, and we're going to kill this managed server, which is managed server 2 that's running on port 7004. We're going to shut down all the requests that it can handle. Once we go back to the servers tab, we'll see that that particular managed server that was configured on port 7004 is no longer running. Let's switch back to our application and the session that's already in progress, and let's reload the page. Once we reload the page, we'll notice that the session counter gets updated to 10. However, the port number associated with the managed server that handled the request is 7003. And because that's the only managed server within the cluster that is still up and running. This was a simple demonstration of setting up a clustered WebLogic configuration in a development environment. A clustered WebLogic configuration provides load balancing, failover, and high availability characteristics to create a zero downtime architecture for mission-critical JE applications, so that you can achieve continued uptime during unplanned and planned outages related to software or hardware failures. Also, by adding additional managed servers to the cluster, we can achieve high scalability to meet increasing demands. For a production environment, there are several other considerations and best practices that must be followed. Please refer to the Oracle WebLogic documentation on www.oracle.com. Thank you for your time.